I was coming home a little later than usual, around 8 at night. The street was quiet, our porch light flickering slightly in that way it does when the bulb's about to give up. As I approached the house, I noticed something strange, a set of tire marks across our lawn, leading right up to the curb. Odd, but not impossible. Could have been the neighbor's kid losing control of his bike again, I figured. When I stepped inside, the usual noise of our home was missing. No laughter from the kids, no smell of dinner cooking. Just silence. It was unsettling, like the whole house had taken a deep breath and was holding it, waiting for something. I called out, "Lauren? Kids?" Nothing. I found her note on the kitchen counter. The note itself was hastily scribbled, written on the back of a grocery receipt, which struck me as strange right off the bat. Lauren was the kind of person who'd leave me a message on the chalkboard by the fridge if she needed to say something, or she'd shoot me a quick text. But this was just left on the counter, the writing so sloppy I had to squint to read it. "Back soon, had to clear my head," it said. "Don't worry about dinner. Kids are at my mom's." I stood there, reading those words over again, letting them sink in. Back soon, she'd written. But why the rush? And what was she clearing her head from? I checked my phone, no text, no missed calls. Lauren was usually reliable about this stuff. Sure, we had our issues now and then, the usual marriage stuff, but nothing drastic enough to warrant a note like this. I poured myself a glass of water and tried to shake the unease. An hour passed, then 2. Still no word from her. I was getting irritated, so I decided to busy myself. I figured if she was having some kind of meltdown, she'd be back sooner if I just gave her space. So, I put on a movie, tried to get comfortable. But even with the sound on, I felt that silence pressing in. And the worst part? I couldn't stop replaying the week in my head, wondering if I'd missed something. Then, I heard it, a car pulling up in the driveway. I jumped up, relieved, but when I peeked through the window, it wasn't her car. It was a sleek black sedan, headlights cutting through the darkness as it idled in the driveway for a long, tense moment. Just as I started to think I should go out there, the engine died, and the driver's door opened. Lauren stepped out, looking rattled. She was dressed a little nicer than usual, nothing over the top, just a bit more polished than she typically was on a Tuesday night. She clutched her purse to her side like it was a shield, glancing up at the house like she expected it to bite her. I opened the front door, keeping my voice calm. "Lauren, what's going on?" She looked at me, clearly startled, and for a second, I thought I saw guilt flash in her eyes. She quickly masked it, forcing a small smile. "Hey. I just went out for a drive," she said, her voice shaky. "Had a lot on my mind. Figured I'd clear my head." "A drive?" I couldn't keep the skepticism out of my voice. "In someone else's car?" Her face paled. She hadn't expected me to notice that. She looked back at the sedan, as if it had just appeared there. "Oh, it's a friend's car. Mine's in the shop." "Right. You didn't mention that this morning." "I must have forgotten," she said quickly, but her voice wavered. She looked everywhere but at me, focusing instead on the kitchen doorway, the flickering porch light anywhere that wasn't my face. I let the silence stretch out, watching her squirm. "Forgot," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, just watching her. She looked back at the car again, as if she wished she could vanish back into it. I didn't say anything right away. I wanted her to feel the weight of that silence. I'd played along with her friend's car excuse for the sake of giving her a moment to come clean, but she didn't seem interested in offering any real explanation. "Whose car?" I finally asked, keeping my tone even. Lauren shifted uncomfortably, clearly weighing her options. Her eyes flitted over to the car, then back to me. "It's just a friend's," she said, fumbling over the word. "I borrowed it for a few hours." I wasn't about to let that slide, not with the way she was acting. "A friend? Okay, so which friend?" I pressed, watching her closely. I'd learned over the years that it's the small details that people trip up on when they lie, and I wasn't going to make it easy for her to dodge this one. She hesitated, her face tightening as she realized there was no quick way out of this. "It's no one you know," she mumbled, still avoiding my eyes. "You're telling me you left a note on a receipt, borrowed some stranger's car, and didn't think to give me a heads up?" My words came out sharper than I intended, but I was done playing dumb. Her eyes narrowed slightly at that, like she'd expected me to just accept her answer and move on. "I didn't think I needed permission to go out for a few hours," she snapped. "Oh, it's not about permission," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "It's about not acting like you're sneaking around, Lauren. Why are you being so evasive? Just tell me who it is, or what's actually going on." For a second, I thought she was going to come clean. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, then shut it just as quickly. Her face was a mix of frustration and maybe a little fear. But instead of offering any kind of real answer, she just shook her head, as if I was being unreasonable. "Fine," she said, looking away. "You're overreacting." I could feel my patience snapping. "Overreacting? You went out in someone else's car, didn't answer your phone, left the kids with your mom without saying a word to me, and now you won't even give me a straight answer about who this friend is. And I'm overreacting?" She let out a frustrated sigh and looked at the car like she was waiting for it to magically pull out of the driveway and take her with it. "Look, if you're going to blow this out of proportion, I'm going to bed," she muttered. That was her way out of this? I didn't think I could be any angrier, but I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I wanted answers, and I was done letting her brush this off like it was nothing. "Lauren, hold on," I said, blocking her path. She didn't make a move to push past me, just stood there, her arms crossed defensively, avoiding my gaze. "I'm not letting this go. I want to know what's going on, and I deserve that much, don't you think?" She bit her lip, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. It looked like she was ready to say something but kept stopping herself. It struck me then that she was struggling, not with me, but with whatever lie she was trying to keep intact. "You know what?" I finally said, stepping back. "Go to bed. If you don't want to tell me the truth, I'll figure it out myself." That got her attention. Her eyes shot to mine, finally, and there was a flicker of something, panic maybe. "What are you talking about?" she asked quickly, a slight tremor in her voice. "I mean, I'm not waiting around for you to decide what version of this story I get to hear," I replied, my voice cold and steady. "You're acting suspicious as hell, Lauren. If you don't want to come clean, fine. But don't expect me to ignore this." Her jaw tightened, and she took a step back. I could see her weighing whether she should try to explain or just walk away. After a long, tense pause, she finally muttered, "Fine. Go ahead and play detective if it makes you feel better." I was beyond the point of taking her bait. "Maybe I will," I said. I watched her expression closely, saw the way her face fell for just a second before she masked it again. She turned and walked up the stairs, leaving me standing there in the silence. I walked over to the window and watched as the car that had brought her home backed out of the driveway and drove off into the night. My pulse was racing, and I could feel that mix of anger and confusion bubbling up, the pieces of the puzzle scattered in my mind. I was done playing along with her half-truths. I was going to figure this out, one way or another. The next day, things were tense. Lauren was avoiding me, barely meeting my eyes, as though we'd silently agreed not to bring up last night's argument. But the problem was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I caught her glancing at her phone, every time she avoided answering a question directly, I felt that frustration flare up again. I didn't care what it took, I was going to get to the bottom of this. That evening, I got my chance. Lauren was on her way out for a meeting she hadn't bothered to tell me about until 5 minutes before she was out the door. I had a choice: let her go and wait around for answers that might never come, or follow her and see for myself. I didn't hesitate long. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and slipped out the door, following her car at a distance. She drove across town, heading toward a part of the city we rarely went to, a neighborhood full of nondescript apartment buildings and small offices. My mind was racing, imagining every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. She finally parked outside a building and went inside without looking back. I stayed in the car, watching, trying to figure out what was going on. After a few minutes, curiosity got the best of me. I got out, locked the car, and made my way toward the building, keeping my distance and watching through the large glass windows. Inside, I saw her talking to a man. Mid-30s, tall, clean-cut. He was dressed casually but put together, and the way he leaned in close when he spoke to her set my teeth on edge. They were laughing, and she was relaxed, almost too comfortable. It felt like a punch to the gut. The man gestured for her to sit down, and they moved to a table in the corner. I couldn't hear their conversation, but from the way she was leaning toward him, I didn't need to. I watched them for what felt like an eternity, anger and hurt building inside me with every second. After a while, she glanced at her watch, said something to the man, and stood up. He nodded, and she walked toward the door. I barely had time to slip back to my car and pretend I hadn't seen a thing as she drove past me on her way out. I sat there for a long time after she'd left, my mind reeling, trying to process what I'd just seen. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces were lining up in ways that were impossible to ignore. When I finally got home, Lauren was there, already settled on the couch with a glass of wine, as if she'd never left. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable, and for a split second, I thought about confronting her right then and there. But I knew she'd deny it, twist the story, try to make it sound innocent. I walked past her without a word, heading straight for our bedroom. I had a lot to think about, and whatever came next, I wasn't going to let her slip out of this one without giving me the truth. That night, I barely slept. I lay there, wide awake, going over every possible angle in my head. Lauren's face kept flashing in my mind, the way she had looked at that guy, the casual way she had lied to my face. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like a fool. The way she'd avoided my questions, the cryptic note, the rushed way she'd left, the mystery car, it all added up to something I didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't letting this slide, not another day. I'd catch her in the act or get the truth out of her one way or another. This wasn't something that would just go away, and I wasn't about to spend another night like that, replaying everything in my head. I had to know what was going on, no matter how ugly it might be. Lauren was already downstairs when I came down, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. She was making coffee, scrolling through her phone, and barely looked up when I walked in. I sat down across from her, staring at her, hoping she'd at least glance my way. But she didn't, and that annoyed me more than I thought it would. "Lauren, we need to talk," I finally said, cutting right to it. She looked up from her phone, raising an eyebrow, clearly irritated. "Can it wait? I'm running late." "Actually, no, it can't," I replied, my voice hard. "We're talking about it now." She sighed heavily, putting her phone down, finally looking at me with an expression that was part annoyance, part boredom. "Fine. What's so urgent?" I kept my tone steady, not letting her casual attitude throw me off. "I want to know who that guy was. The one you met last night. I followed you, Lauren. I know something's going on." For a split second, her face paled, and I saw something close to panic flash across her eyes. But she quickly masked it, forcing a calm expression that was almost laughable considering the situation. "You followed me?" she asked, incredulous, like I was the one in the wrong. "Are you serious right now?" "Dead serious," I replied, my voice cold. "And I'm not interested in any more lies. I want the truth, Lauren. Who is he?" She crossed her arms, looking away, clearly uncomfortable. "He's just a friend," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "Just a friend," I repeated, disbelief dripping from my tone. "Just a friend you meet late at night without telling me, without answering my calls, and drive home in his car? Do you really expect me to believe that?" She didn't answer right away, just looked down at the table, fiddling with her coffee mug, as if she could just avoid the question until it went away. But I wasn't about to drop it. "Look at me," I said firmly. She glanced up, her eyes wary. "I saw the way you were with him. You're not fooling anyone, Lauren. Just tell me the truth." She bit her lip, clearly struggling, and for a second, I thought she might actually come clean. But then, she shook her head, putting on an expression that was somewhere between defiance and desperation. "You don't understand," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What don't I understand?" I pressed. "Make me understand, Lauren. Who is he?" "It's not like that," she insisted, her voice wavering. "We're just talking. He's someone I can confide in. That's all." Her answer was like a slap in the face. I couldn't believe the nerve she had, sitting here, looking me in the eyes, and feeding me this garbage. "Confide in?" I repeated, my tone harsher than I intended. "You're telling me you're confiding in some stranger about things you can't tell me, your husband?" She looked away again, and that was all the answer I needed. I felt my chest tighten, anger and hurt boiling up inside me. I had tried to get her to open up, tried to give her a chance to come clean, but she was still lying, still acting like I was the one overreacting. "I can't believe you," I said quietly, shaking my head. "I can't believe you treat me like this. You're my wife, Lauren. We have a family, a life together, and this is how you handle things? By sneaking around with some guy and lying to my face?" She flinched, clearly taken aback by the anger in my voice, but she didn't try to defend herself. She just sat there, looking down, silent. "Is it worth it?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Is whatever you have with him worth throwing all of this away?" Her silence was answer enough, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I had spent years with this woman, trusted her, built a life with her, and now she was sitting here, refusing to give me the truth, refusing to even try to salvage what we had. "I'm done," I said finally, standing up. "If you're not willing to be honest, then there's nothing left to talk about." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, not looking back. I needed to clear my head, get away from her, from the lies, from everything. I grabbed my keys and left the house, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get as far away from her as possible. I drove around for hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything, but there was no making sense of it. I couldn't believe that this was happening, that the woman I had trusted, the woman I had built my life around, could betray me like this. It felt surreal, like some kind of twisted dream I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, I found myself parked outside a friend's house, a guy I hadn't seen in months but who had always been there for me when things got rough. I hesitated, not sure if I wanted to drag him into this, but I couldn't go home. I couldn't face her, not after everything that had just happened. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, he opened it, looking surprised to see me. "Hey, man," he said, stepping back to let me in. "Everything okay?" I didn't answer right away, just walked inside, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. I didn't even know where to start, how to explain what was going on. But he didn't push me. He just poured me a drink and sat down, waiting for me to speak when I was ready. I took a long sip, letting the alcohol burn away some of the anger, some of the pain, and finally, I started talking. I told him everything about the note, the lies, the man she'd been meeting. As I spoke, the reality of it all hit me harder than it had before, and I felt the anger giving way to something else, something deeper. I wasn't just angry, I was hurt, betrayed in a way I never thought possible. He listened quietly, letting me vent, not interrupting, just nodding here and there. When I was finished, he sat back, looking at me with a mixture of sympathy and anger. "I can't believe she'd do that to you," he said finally, shaking his head. "After everything you've done for her, for your family." "Yeah," I muttered, my voice bitter. "Neither can I." We sat there in silence for a while, both of us lost in thought. I didn't know what to do next, didn't know how to handle this. Part of me wanted to confront her, force her to admit the truth, but another part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. She'd already made her choice, already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Eventually, my friend spoke up. "You know," he said slowly, "if she's not willing to come clean, you have every right to find out the truth yourself." I looked at him, frowning. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm just saying, maybe it's time to take matters into your own hands. If she won't tell you what's going on, maybe you should figure it out for yourself." The idea made sense, more sense than anything else I'd thought of. If she wasn't going to be honest, if she was going to keep lying to my face, then I had every right to find out the truth. I couldn't just sit back and let her keep me in the dark, not after everything we'd been through. I nodded slowly, the decision settling in my mind. I was done waiting, done giving her chances to come clean. I was going to get to the bottom of this, and I didn't care what it took. By the time I got home, it was late, and the house was dark. Lauren was already in bed, and I could hear her breathing softly, like she didn't have a care in the world. I stood in the doorway, looking at her, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. How could she sleep so easily, knowing what she was doing to us, to me? I walked to the other side of the bed, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling through her social media, her messages, anything that might give me a hint. But she was careful, too careful. It was like she'd already thought of everything, already covered her tracks. But I wasn't giving up. I'd find a way to get to the truth, one way or another. And when I did, I'd finally have the answers I needed, the answers she'd refused to give me. The next morning, I was ready before she even got up. I hadn't slept much, but I'd made a plan. She could hide the details all she wanted, but there were always cracks, and I was determined to find them. When Lauren finally came downstairs, she didn't look surprised to see me already up, but she did seem wary. I could see it in the way she hesitated at the bottom step, her eyes flicking toward me, like she expected another confrontation. Well, this time, I wasn't giving her one. I decided to keep things quiet, keep her calm so she wouldn't cover her tracks. I forced myself to act normal, act like yesterday's fight hadn't happened, and that alone took every ounce of patience I had left. "Morning," she said, pouring herself coffee without looking at me. "Morning," I replied, as casually as I could manage. She eyed me for a moment, but when I didn't press her about anything, she seemed to relax. She glanced at the clock, muttered something about running late, and disappeared upstairs to get ready. As soon as she was out of earshot, I was on her phone. I only had a minute or two, but that was all I needed. I went straight to her call log and recent messages, hoping there would be something, anything, but she'd already deleted everything. Either she was careful, or she'd anticipated that I'd check. I was about to put the phone down when I noticed a small notification at the top of the screen, from an app one didn't recognize, a group chat app I'd never seen her use before. It was an odd name too, one I hadn't heard of, and I doubted it was anything work-related. I tapped on it, holding my breath, praying it wasn't password protected. It opened up right away, and there it was, a list of contacts, with messages going back and forth. It didn't take me long to figure out which one was the man from last night. He'd sent her a few new messages that morning, and I opened them quickly, scanning the words. "Last night was amazing, can't wait to see you again." There it was, right in front of me, in his words. I felt that wave of nausea and anger all over again, but I pushed it down. I forced myself to stay focused. I couldn't afford to lose my cool, not now. Not when I was this close to knowing the truth. I took a few quick screenshots and sent them to myself. If she caught me with her phone, it was over, but the risk was worth it. I backed out of the app, set the phone down, and picked up the newspaper, trying to look as casual as possible. A few minutes later, she came back downstairs, grabbing her coffee and saying goodbye with barely a glance in my direction. As soon as she left, I checked my phone to make sure the screenshots had gone through. They had. I spent the rest of the day looking into this guy, trying to piece together who he was. It didn't take long to find him on social media. His profile was public, full of photos of him living what looked like an expensive, indulgent life. Vacations, fancy dinners, expensive cars. He looked about our age, maybe a few years older. There were photos of him with friends, colleagues, but no pictures of a wife, no signs of a family. Just him, living the good life. And then I found a photo of him and Lauren, just the two of them, taken at some upscale restaurant a couple of months ago. That photo hit me harder than anything else. She looked happy, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I couldn't stop staring at it, couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that kept building with every second. This wasn't some misunderstanding, some innocent friendship. This was real, and it was deliberate. I saved the photo and kept digging, my anger building with every new piece of information. I found out where he worked, some high-end consulting firm downtown. His position explained the nice things, the lifestyle. He wasn't just some guy, he was someone with money, someone who could offer her the kind of lifestyle she'd only get by tearing apart our family. It took me a while to pull myself out of that spiral, but I knew I had to stay focused. The screenshots, the photo, none of it would matter unless I confronted her with it, forced her to come clean. But I wasn't about to let her turn this around on me, to act like I was the one in the wrong for checking up on her. I needed something she couldn't deny, something that would make it impossible for her to keep lying. I knew what I had to do next. The next evening, I told Lauren I was going out, grabbing a beer with a friend. She didn't ask questions, barely looked up from her phone as she nodded and told me to have a good time. I could tell she was relieved I hadn't pressed her on anything else since our argument the day before. She probably thought I was letting it go, that I'd dropped it. Little did she know, I'd planned this down to the minute. I parked a few blocks away from the building where her mystery man worked. I knew from his public profile that he liked to stay late, something he was apparently proud of, considering he'd posted about it multiple times. I waited in my car, watching as employees filtered out of the building one by one. After nearly 2 hours, he finally came out. Alone, looking as smug and self-satisfied as he did in his photos. I followed him from a distance, watching as he made his way down the street, finally stopping at a nearby bar. I watched him go inside, and a few minutes later, I followed. I kept my distance, ordering a drink and finding a spot across the room where I could keep an eye on him. I didn't know what I was going to do if he saw me, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to see this guy, needed to know what kind of person my wife thought was worth risking everything for. He sat alone, scrolling through his phone, looking up now and then as if he was waiting for someone. I had a sick feeling I knew who that someone was. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, Lauren walked in, scanning the room until she saw him. She went over to his table, and he stood up, pulling her into a hug that lasted a little too long, his hand lingering on her waist. They sat down together, leaning in close, talking quietly, smiling at each other in a way that made me want to storm over there and drag her out by the arm. But I stayed put, forcing myself to watch, to take it all in, even as every second felt like it was tearing me apart. They ordered drinks, talking and laughing like this was just another date night, like they were just any other couple enjoying a night out. I watched as he reached across the table, his hand covering hers, and she didn't pull away. She just sat there, looking at him, completely absorbed, like I didn't even exist. Like our life, our marriage, was nothing more than a distant memory. When they finally left, I followed them out, keeping my distance as they walked down the street, eventually stopping in front of his car. They talked for a few more minutes, standing close, looking at each other like they were the only two people in the world. And then he leaned in, and she didn't stop him. She let him kiss her, right there in the open, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt a white-hot rage building inside me, but I held back, forcing myself to stay hidden. I needed to see how far this would go, needed to know the full extent of her betrayal. They stood there for a long time, talking softly, holding each other close. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, she pulled away, saying something I couldn't hear, and got into her own car. He watched her go, smiling to himself, before getting into his car and driving off. I waited until he was gone, until the street was empty, and then I finally stepped out of the shadows, standing there, staring at the spot where they'd just been. I felt like I was going to be sick. It was one thing to suspect, to imagine, but seeing it with my own eyes was something else entirely. There was no coming back from this, no way to undo what I'd just seen. When I got home, Lauren was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I knew she was faking it because her breathing was too steady, too controlled. She probably thought I wouldn't question her if she acted like she was sleeping. I stood there in the doorway, watching her, wondering how she could lie there, pretending like everything was normal, after what I'd just witnessed. I thought about waking her up, confronting her right then and there, but I held back. This wasn't the moment. I wasn't going to give her a chance to weasel her way out of this, to twist things around and make excuses. I'd let her think she'd gotten away with it, let her dig herself even deeper. And when the time was right, I'd confront her, armed with the truth she couldn't deny. I left the room and went downstairs, sitting in the dark, replaying everything I'd seen, every lie she'd told, every excuse she'd made. The betrayal was like a weight in my chest, suffocating me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to think clearly. She thought she could keep me in the dark, keep lying to my face while sneaking around with this guy. But I wasn't in the dark anymore. I knew exactly what was going on, and I wasn't going to let her keep playing me. As I sat there, I made up my mind. I wasn't just going to confront her, I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of betrayal, every bit of the pain she'd put me through. And when it was over, she'd finally understand what it meant to cross me. The next morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I had no intention of just sitting around while Lauren kept sneaking out, lying to my face, meeting him like they were living in some kind of romantic daydream. She had no idea that her secrets were unraveling right under her nose, and I planned to keep it that way for now. It was time to gather enough proof so that when I finally confronted her, there would be nothing for her to hide behind, nowhere for her to run. That day, I kept up the pretense, acting as though everything was perfectly normal. I knew she'd be in and out, always careful to mask her tracks, and I intended to give her enough room to think I was oblivious. When I left the house, I didn't go to work. Instead, I drove downtown to visit a private investigator I'd looked up the night before. If there was one thing I needed, it was a solid plan, and he was going to help me build it. I met him in his small, neatly organized office tucked between a legal office and an insurance company. He was around 50, maybe older, but he had that sharp, experienced look that let me know he was the right man for the job. We sat down, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, nodding here and there, clearly making mental notes. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "It's good that you came in," he said, getting right to the point. "It's better to get all the facts, and to document it carefully. That way, she can't gaslight you when the time comes. And if you decide to file for divorce, you'll have more than enough evidence." He then laid out the plan. He'd tail her, catch her every move on camera, get concrete proof of her activities, and put together a detailed report. It would take about a week to gather everything, but by the end, I'd have all the evidence I needed. His confidence was reassuring, and for the first time in days, I felt like I was back in control. We set up a schedule and agreed on how he'd keep me updated. I shook his hand, thanked him, and left his office with a sense of grim determination. There was no turning back now. Lauren had made her choice, and I was going to make sure she faced every consequence of it. Over the next few days, I kept things as normal as possible. If Lauren noticed anything different, she didn't let on. She was cautious around me, sure, but more in a way that suggested she thought I'd let the argument slide. She had no idea I was biding my time, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the evidence to stack up. The investigator texted me updates in real time. Every day brought new details that only confirmed what I'd already seen. She was meeting her lover at various places around town, restaurants, his office, even a park. They were careful not to do anything too obvious in public, but the photos he sent were damning. There were shots of them holding hands, sitting close together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. It was like they existed in this separate bubble, just the two of them, where I didn't exist. I kept looking at each photo he sent, studying her face, the way she looked at this guy, the way she smiled. It was a side of her I hadn't seen in a long time, and that thought alone was like a punch to the gut every time I saw her walk through the door at night, pretending like everything was fine. Then, one evening, the investigator called me directly, something he'd only do if there was something urgent. His voice was calm, but I could tell he had news that would take things to the next level. "They went to a hotel today," he said simply. "Got checked in, stayed for about 3 hours, and then left separately." I sat there, gripping my phone tightly, feeling that rush of anger and disgust all over again. I'd suspected it, of course, but hearing it, knowing that she was so comfortable with it, so bold, that was another level of betrayal. This wasn't just some emotional fling or innocent confiding. This was deliberate, and she was all in, willing to risk our life together for it. I thanked him and hung up, sitting in silence for a while, letting it all sink in. There was no doubt about it now, no chance she could twist her way out of it. I had everything I needed. It was just a matter of time before I confronted her, and I was going to make sure she understood the full weight of what she'd done. 2 days later, I decided to confront her. I'd had enough, and I couldn't stand one more second of watching her act like everything was fine while she sneaked around with him, hiding everything behind that calm mask. I knew she'd try to deny it, try to lie her way out of it. But I was ready for that. When she got home, I was waiting. She came in, setting her bag on the counter, a casual greeting on her lips before she saw my face. Something in my expression must have given it away because her smile faltered, and she looked at me warily, as though she sensed that everything was about to change. "We need to talk," I said, my voice colder than I'd intended. She hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "About what?" she asked, trying to sound innocent, but I could see the apprehension in her eyes. "About the lies, Lauren. About the guy you've been meeting. I know everything. I know where you've been, who you've been with, and what you've been doing. So don't even think about lying." Her face went pale, her eyes widening as the realization hit her. She opened her mouth, probably to deny it, but I wasn't in the mood to let her play games. I grabbed my phone and opened the gallery, showing her the photos, their dinner, their walks, even the hotel. I watched as her expression shifted from shock to horror, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process what she was seeing. I can explain," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Oh, please do," I replied, folding my arms. "I'd love to hear how you're going to explain this away." She looked at me, her face crumbling as she struggled to come up with an excuse. It's not what it looks like," she said weakly, the words sounding hollow, even to her. "Not what it looks like?" I echoed, anger flaring up again. "Lauren, I have photos of you meeting him, sneaking around, holding hands, checking into a hotel. So tell me, what is it then?" She looked down, unable to meet my gaze, clearly realizing that she was cornered. I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. I don't know. I felt." "Save it," I interrupted, my voice laced with disgust. "I don't want to hear how you didn't mean for it to happen. I want to know why you thought it was worth destroying everything we had." She looked up at me, tears in her eyes now, her face a mix of shame and desperation. I don't know, okay?" I felt stuck, like we weren't going anywhere. He was just there, and he listened, he cared. "Really?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "He cared? Enough to sneak around behind my back, knowing you were married, knowing you had a family?" She flinched, clearly stung, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel it, to understand exactly what she'd done. "You know what I see, Lauren?" I continued, my voice rising. "I see someone who didn't have the guts to face her problems, so she ran off with the first guy who gave her a bit of attention. And you know what? I don't care why you did it. I care that you lied, over and over, while you pretended that everything was fine." Her tears were falling now, but they did nothing to soften my anger. She tried to speak, her words choked by her sobs, but I didn't want to hear it. I'd given her chances to come clean, to be honest, and she'd chosen to lie. I wasn't about to let her twist things around now. "Do you realize what you've done?" I asked quietly, my voice cold and controlled. "Do you realize what this means?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear, like she was finally understanding that there was no way out of this, no easy fix. "Please." "I didn't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's too late," I said, my voice like ice. "You already did." I turned and left the room, her sobs echoing behind me. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of justice. Just a numb, hollow feeling that settled in my chest as I walked away, knowing that the life I thought we'd built together was over, destroyed by her choices, her lies. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell her where I was going, didn't say goodbye. She didn't deserve that courtesy, not after everything she'd done. As I drove away, I felt the weight of it all sink in, but there was also a strange sense of relief, a feeling that at least, finally, I knew the truth. I left without a destination in mind, driving aimlessly through the quiet, empty streets. The city lights blurred around me as I tried to wrap my head around everything that had happened, everything Lauren had done. After everything we'd been through together, she'd thrown it all away for some guy she barely knew. It didn't feel real yet, almost like I'd stumbled into someone else's life. I parked in an empty lot and just sat there, staring at the empty space around me, wondering how it had come to this. The silence in the car was deafening. I'd walked out of the life we'd built together, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I'd walked out a long time ago. I'd just been too blind to notice the cracks spreading beneath us. As I sat there, my phone buzzed with a new message. I pulled it out of my pocket, already knowing it would be from her. She'd probably tried calling me a dozen times already, each one going to voicemail. But there it was, a text from Lauren, with the predictable "I'm sorry and I didn't mean to hurt you" and the same tired excuses she'd used the night I confronted her. She wanted to talk, to explain herself, to somehow make me believe that this was all some huge misunderstanding. But there was nothing she could say that would change anything, nothing she could tell me that would make what she'd done any easier to accept. I blocked her number right there, cutting off any chance of her getting through to me. I was done with her, done with all of it. For the next few days, I kept my distance. I crashed at a friend's place, letting him think I was just there because I'd needed a break. He knew about the argument, about the strange behavior, but I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear myself say the words out loud, wasn't ready to make it all real. So I spent those days lying low, trying to piece myself back together, trying to figure out what my next move would be. On the third day, I called my lawyer. The conversation was short, mostly because I didn't have much to say. I told him I was ready to file for divorce, ready to end this mess. He'd known me for years, since long before I'd married Lauren, and he could tell that I wasn't interested in dragging things out. I wanted it done cleanly, as quickly as possible, with no chance of her contesting it. Once the papers were drawn up, I'd planned to send them to her, have her deal with it in her own time. But that plan fell apart the moment I stepped into our house to grab my things. Lauren was there, sitting on the couch, looking like she hadn't slept since I'd left. I'd expected her to be upset, to be miserable, but seeing her there in person was like seeing a stranger in my own home. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes wide and red-rimmed, and I could tell she'd been waiting for me, maybe even hoping I'd come back. "I need to get my things," I said coldly, not bothering with any kind of greeting. "I'll be out of here in a few minutes." She stood up, clutching a tissue in her hand, her voice trembling as she tried to speak. "Can we just talk for a minute? Please?" I didn't respond. I walked past her, heading for the bedroom, trying to block out her pleading voice as she followed me, trying to make me stop, to listen to whatever excuse she'd come up with. I started packing my clothes, keeping my back to her as she hovered by the door, wringing her hands, her voice thick with desperation. "Please, just give me a chance to explain," she begged, stepping closer as I tossed my things into a bag. "I know I messed up, okay? I know I did. But it wasn't what you think, it." "Stop," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. I turned to face her, my anger bubbling over as I looked at her, standing there with that pathetic expression on her face, like she was the victim in all of this. "Just stop, Lauren. I'm not interested in hearing your excuses. I've seen everything I need to see. I know everything I need to know." Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was just lost. I felt like I was suffocating, like we were just going through the motions. And that's supposed to justify what you did?" I shot back, my voice filled with disbelief. "You think because you were lost, that makes it okay to sneak around, to lie to my face? You could have talked to me, Lauren. You could have told me how you were feeling. But you didn't. You chose to run off with him instead." She shook her head, struggling to find the right words, but I was done listening. I zipped up my bag, slinging it over my shoulder, pushing past her without another word. But as I reached the door, she grabbed my arm, forcing me to stop, her grip tighter than I expected. "Wait," she said, her voice frantic. "Please. Just give me one more chance. I'll do anything to make this right." I looked at her hand on my arm, then met her gaze, seeing the desperation in her eyes, the fear. And for a brief second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But that sympathy vanished the moment I remembered the way she'd looked at him, the way she'd smiled at him, like he was her whole world, like I was nothing more than an afterthought. You already made your choice, I said, my voice cold and final. And I'm making mine. I shook her hand off my arm and walked out, not looking back, not letting myself falter. This was the end. I'd made my decision, and there was no going back. Later that day, I sat down with my lawyer, going over the details of the divorce, laying out the terms. I didn't want anything from her, no money, no property, nothing that would tie me to her. All I wanted was a clean break, a fresh start, and the sooner it was done, the better. I'd made it clear that I wasn't interested in a drawn-out legal battle, and he'd assured me that we could push it through quickly if she didn't contest it. And from the look in her eyes when I'd walked out, I knew she wouldn't. She knew she'd lost, knew there was nothing she could do to fix this. She'd burned every bridge, destroyed every ounce of trust I'd had in her, and I was done. The days blurred together after that, each one bleeding into the next as I waited for the papers to be finalized. Friends reached out, tried to get me to talk about it, to open up, but I couldn't. I didn't want to share the details, didn't want to relive the pain every time I told the story. I just wanted to move on, to put it behind me and leave it in the past where it belonged. I found myself going through old photos, old messages, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. I went back years, back to when things were good, back to the days when I thought we were happy. But as I looked at those memories, I realized something that hit me harder than any of the betrayal, any of the lies. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being a team. We'd stopped sharing things, stopped supporting each other. We'd become strangers in the same house, going through the motions, pretending everything was fine because it was easier than facing the truth. And maybe that was why she'd drifted away, why she'd sought out something she couldn't find with me. But none of that excused what she'd done. None of that made it right. On the day the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange sense of relief. The papers arrived in the mail, and I signed them without hesitation, sealing the end of everything we'd built together. I didn't feel sadness, didn't feel regret. I felt free. I sent the signed papers back, not bothering to reach out to her, not needing any kind of closure. She'd made her choice, and I'd made mine, and there was nothing left to say. A few weeks later, I found myself back in that same empty parking lot where I'd sat the night I'd left. I'd come here almost without thinking, drawn back to the place where everything had changed. I sat there, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, feeling that strange mix of anger and sadness that had haunted me since it all began. But this time, it felt different. This time, the anger was gone, replaced by a sense of acceptance, of clarity. I didn't need answers anymore, didn't need to understand why she'd done what she'd done. It didn't matter. She was a part of my past now, a chapter that had ended, and I was ready to turn the page. As I sat there, I thought about what was next, about what I wanted from my life. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control again, like I was free to decide my own path, unburdened by the weight of her lies, her betrayal. I started the car and drove away, leaving that empty lot behind, leaving the memories, the pain, everything that had held me back. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. I was ready to move on, ready to start over. I didn't know what the future held, but whatever it was mine.